Technological change. Farmers. The character of the soil for 400 miles west of the Missouri River and lying near the route of the Union Pacific Road may be described as of great fertility and possessing superior productive qualities. The lands are now open to occupancy by the settler, whose claim and title will be confirmed when the offices of the land department of the road are established and ready for business. The Central Pacific Road, by reason of its more lengthy mountain route, has not the same extent of agricultural land to offer to the settlers as the Union Pacific, but it is by no means destitute. The valley of the Humboldt River is traversed by the Central Pacific, and this region contains some good land and an abundance of wood and water. The close proximity of this valley to rich mineral regions and the ready and profitable market which such regions furnish for agricultural products will make every available acre a flourishing garden or well-cultivated farm. In the valley of the Sacramento River, many varieties of semi-tropical fruits are cultivated successfully. The almond, olive, and pomegranate thrive well. The season of grass growing commences immediately after the rains of December and continues until summer heat, affording abundant forage for cattle and other stock. This is from a book by Frederick Goddard called Where to Emigrate and Why: Homes and Fortunes in the Boundless West and Sunny South, with a complete history and description of the Pacific Railroad, from 1869. Reasons to farm. Farmers and families who wanted to be farmers flocked to the West as the Transcontinental Railroad reached completion. Advertisements designed by railroad companies and books and travel guides such as Goddard's made the West seem like a land of unlimited opportunity. The railroads encouraged settlement along the railroad lines because new farms meant money for passenger fares, freight charges, and land sales. Many railroads provided credit terms, special passenger rates, and agricultural assistance for prospective residents to attract them to the West. In addition to the claims of great opportunity, many families were attracted by the available of cheap and even free land. In addition to the Homestead Act of 1862, many Western states made similar offers of free land to farmers who agreed to settle it. Railroad companies sold tracts of land that the U.S. and state governments had given them to build rail lines. The government had given the companies more land than what was needed for the lines so that the railroad companies could sell the land to make the money needed for construction. Hundreds of thousands of families took advantage of offers for free and cheap land. Most settlers were immigrants from Europe, such as Germans and Swedes. Farmers or farm workers from the East who wanted to own larger farms, and newly freed African Americans who saw moving west as an opportunity to escape the conditions in the South. Farming conditions. However, farming conditions in the West were tough. Thousands of families were unable to make a profit from their farms and lost them. Some historians have said that the problems of the farmers in this area were as difficult as the problems of the early settlers in Jamestown. The Great Plains were plagued by blizzards in the winter and drought and hot winds in the summer, when temperatures were frequently above 100 degrees. The summer droughts brought prairie fires and dust storms. Some years, insects such as grasshoppers came in clouds that blotted out the sunlight and chewed crops to their roots. The key to survival on the Great Plains was inventiveness and hard work. Technological changes affecting farming. The Great Plains have few trees. As a result, many families built homes of sod bricks made from dried pieces of land. Joseph Glidden, an Illinois farmer, invented barbed wire fencing that was used as an alternative to traditional wood and stone fences in the East. Farmers and cattlemen strung up the barbed wire almost as fast as it could be produced to fence in their land and establish boundaries. Technological advances helped the farmers cultivate the dry land of the plains. James Oliver in Indiana perfected a process of cooling cast iron quickly with the stream of water to harden the metal. The result of his work was the chilled plow that was able to break the soil of the Great Plains. The problem of water supply was harder to solve. Many farms created irrigation systems to redirect available water, but in many cases, this was not enough. The solution was to use steel windmills that harnessed the constant free power of the prairie winds to pump water from the deep wells. Heavier pieces of machinery, many powered by steam engines, were used by farmers to make farming in the West more productive. Wheat farming was improved by the invention of the self-binding harvesters that cut and tied bundles of wheat. The combine not only cut wheat, but also separated and cleaned the grain. The effect of the mechanization was powerful. An acre that had required 61 hours to farm by hand took only 3 hours to farm by machine. And where one man could farm only 7.5 acres by the old methods, he could take on 135 acres in the 1890s with these improvements. By 1900, the steam tractor, which pulled 16 plows, 4 harrows, and a seed drill simultaneously, could break the soil and plant as many as 50 acres a day, was in use. A crucial resource for farmers in the West was the railroad. The railroad provided access to new equipment as well as transportation for crops to urban markets. Grain elevators were built next to railroad stops so crops such as wheat could be stored where railroads would pick them up for shipment. For families in the West, the railroad made it possible to receive finished goods from catalog companies such as the Montgomery Wards and the Sears Roebuck catalog. Shopping provided access to the modern innovations and conveniences of life in the East. While innovations in machinery and transportation improved the efficiency of farming, the cost of the machinery put many small farm families deep into debt. Many found that farming in the West was not the utopian dream described in advertisements. Combinations such as long spells of severe weather, falling prices for crops, and the high cost of new machinery and rail shipping caused the failure of 2/3 of the homesteaders' farms on the Great Plains by 1900. Western Kansas alone lost half of its population between 1888 and 1892. Technological change. Ranchers. Those first trail outfits in the 70s were sure tough. They had very little grub, and they usually run out of that and lived on straight beef. They had only 3 or 4 horses to the man, mostly with sore backs, because old-time saddles eat both away, the horse's back and the cowboy's pistol pocket. They had no tents, no tarps, and damn few slickers. They never kicked because those boys was raised under just the same conditions as there was on the trail. Cornmeal and bacon for grub, dirt floors in the houses, and no luxuries. In the early days of Texas, in the 60s, when they gathered their cattle, they used to pack what was needed on a horse and go out for weeks on a cow hunt, they called it. That was before Roundup was invented and before they had anything so civilized as mess wagons. In person, the cowboys were mostly medium-sized men, as a heavy man was hard on horses, quick and wiry, and as a rule, very good-natured. In fact, it did not pay to be anything else. In character like theirs, there like never was or will be again. From E.C. Abbott and H.H. Smith, We Pointed Them North, 1955. Reasons to ranch. For a time, cattlemen had the benefit of the open range on the Great Plains with almost limitless, ownerless grass that was there for the taking. As the American government established it as a public land, ranchers used the open range for grazing herds of cattle. Within a short period, herds of buffalo were replaced by herds of cattle. Ranchers hired cowboys to take the cattle to market on hoof. For a brief period before the arrival of the farmer, the Great Plains was an open range of cattle ranches. Spurred by an increase in the demand for meat in the industrialized cities of the East and the ability of the railroad to transport cattle to markets, the cattle industry and the American cowboy experienced a boom after the Civil War. The roots of the American ranch go back to the first settlers in the Southwest who learned how to raise longhorn cattle from the Mexicans in the area. Cowboys were sometimes known as cowpokes or cowpunchers, names derived from the early method of prodding cattle with long poles to move them along the trail. Borrowing many of the methods of the Mexicans, American cowboys rode horses across the open plains of Texas and New Mexico to keep the huge herds of cattle together. Keeping track of the herd required constant supervision. A cowboy started his day before the sun came up and worked well past sunset, often working 18 hours or more a day. Technological changes affecting ranching. Ranch owners identified their cattle on the unfenced plains by a brand burned on by the cowboys. During the summer, cowboys rounded up the herds of up to 3,000 cattle and drove them north out of Texas on long drives, following cattle trails like the Chisholm and the Goodnight Loving to reach towns such as Abilene, Ellsworth, and Dodge City, where there were railroad stops. In fact, Abilene, founded by J.G. McCoy, was the first town built for the specific purpose of receiving cows for shipment to market. Rail towns usually consisted of a stockyard, a hotel, a general store, gambling halls, saloons, clothing stores, and barbershops. As the towns grew in size and permanence, increased business opportunities brought families out west. Schools and hired police forces became part of the town. From the rail town, the cattle were shipped by railroad car to slaughterhouses in Chicago. Despite the price of shipping cattle, profits were to be made by sending cattle east. In 1866, a steer that would bring about $4 in Texas could be sold for $40 or $50 in the eastern markets. Innovations also helped increase the demand for beef. The refrigerated railroad car allowed slaughtered cattle from Chicago to travel to eastern markets. However, cattle ranching on the open range was often risky business. Herds were exposed to harsh weather conditions, and adequate care and breeding of the animals was difficult. While railroads helped ranchers take advantage of the eastern markets, they were also part of the end of the open range as farmers came west to stake claims to available land. The barbed wire fences of privately owned farms closed off the open range to the herds who needed thousands of acres for grazing. In time, ranchers began to fence off their land to control access to the land and the water. However, many tried to maintain herds that were too large, and in time, their lands became overgrazed. The closing of the open range, overgrazed by large cattle populations and severe winter and droughts from 1885 to 1887, led to difficult economic times for the American ranchers. While some large landowners and corporate ranches were able to weather the tough times, many went broke. Those that survived turned to practices such as growing hay to feed cattle in the winter, as they adjusted to the more contained nature of ranching. Technological changes, miners. Reasons to mine. There had been gold rushes from time to time in the East, but an entirely new scale of activity was set by the Columbia Gold Rush from 1848 to 1858, which yielded $555 million. Gold rushes occurred again and again in Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Alaska. When mineral ore was found in an area, prospectors, people hoping to stake a claim of the area rich in ore, came from around the country. The promise of quick riches, even a modest amount of wealth, was enough. After a discovery, the news would leak out and there'd be a scramble by miners to get to the area to stake their claim. Early in the discovery, the simple technique of placer mining, in which gold was washed in pans called cradles or sluice boxes, was sufficient for finding gold and silver. With nothing more than a pick, a shovel, a pan, a prospector could gather up loose gold that had washed down to the bedrock surface. Technological changes affecting mining. As time passed in an area, gold and silver became increasingly more difficult to find on the surface. New methods were created to get at the hidden ore. Hydraulic mining, which used water pressure to wash away mountains of gravel and expose the minerals underneath, and hard rock mining, which involves sinking deep shafts to get at ore locked in veins of quartz, became the backbone of American mining. However, these methods were expensive and beyond the resources of individual prospectors. Science, rather than instinct, became the key to success in mining, as it became dominated by large mining companies. Life as a miner. Early prospectors often lived in mining camps that sprang up when silver or gold was found. Miners lived in tents and crude shacks, and competition between the men often led to violence. In areas where the mineral reserves were large, boom towns developed seemingly overnight. Over time, an area required heavy mining techniques to get deep-lying minerals. Prospectors didn't have the money to invest in these techniques, so mining companies were formed. Businesses such as shops, saloons, and boarding houses made huge amounts of money from prospectors and employees of the mining companies. Mark Twain arrived at Virginia City, Nevada in the early days of the Comstock Lode mine and described the town in Roughing It. So great was the pack that buggies frequently had to wait a half hour for an opportunity to cross the principal street. Joy sat on every countenance, and there was a glad, almost fierce intensity in every eye that told of the money-getting schemes that were seething in every brain and the high hope that held sway in every heart. A dozen breweries and a half a dozen jails and station houses in full operation, and some talk of building a church. The flush times were in magnificent flower. In these boom towns, men would often outnumber women 10 to 1. Every camp and town attracted its share of lawless outcasts such as jailbirds, gamblers, and stagecoach robbers. Cheap whiskey flowed in the saloons and gambling was common. The crime rate was so high that many deaths in many camps and towns were from personal conflicts. In some towns, residents formed their own law enforcement bodies, which often used vigilante justice. When a mining site was worked out, meaning the ore ran out, people would move on to the next strike, leaving behind ghost towns. Some boom towns did continue to flourish as large mining companies took over sites where hydraulic and hard rock mining could get to the ore. In these towns, such as Denver, Boulder, Colorado, Solo prospectors were replaced by families, and churches, schools, and theaters were opened. The big mining companies employed large numbers of workers for hard and dangerous labor. Most independent miners did not strike it rich and either returned home poor or took on a job as a laborer with the mining company. Mining not only stimulated the settlement of the West, but it also had an impact on politics of the nation. Miners traded gold and silver for paper currency called greenbacks. With the discovery of large silver deposits in the West, the vast increase in the supply of silver created a crisis over the relative value of gold and silver-backed currency. This became a leading political issue for both Westerners and the nation in the 1880s and 1890s.